Idealliance BrandQ webinar. Today's topic is design intent, and we'll get right into that in just a minute. But it's all about how designers and marketing can figure out what the supply chain can do and make sure they're designing to it. And there's a bunch of efficiency and time savings and things like that. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to do it, and then Sonja is going to share some of her experience too. So I'm going to have Tim introduce who we are and Idealliance and everything, and then we'll move on and get started.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Tim Beckley, and thanks for joining the webinar today. And thank you, Ron, for being here again. And thank you, Sonja Dearden from Lindt, for joining us today. It's wonderful to have you on and presenting and everything you do. And what's great about this topic is this is a hugely important topic around the world, and one that everything begins and ends with this. And I've been able to see Sonja actually do this firsthand in different parts of the world outside of America and many others. And we're so grateful that she's able to share her expertise, and Ron, your expertise with this, and everyone's participating. So with that, we'll get started with you kicking off, Ron, and going through.
Yeah, great. Excellent. Thanks, Tim. My name is Ron Ellis. I'm a consultant. I'm a consultant and do a lot with Idealliance as well. Work as chair of print properties and G7 expert, like many of you probably are, and G7 trainer as well. And then our panelist today is Sonja Dearden, and she's probably probably the most important person on this panel because she's gone through this from the brand perspective. So she's a print production manager at Lindt, and can't hand you chocolates through the screen, but that would probably be cool. But anyway, she's gone through this where she went from a brand where they basically didn't really spec printing, bought lots of printing, but didn't control it that well, and to a point where they have, a very good print quality program that she's the person behind and who engineered and everything. What we're going to talk about today is design intent. And this is the idea of how a designer or a creative or brand can come up with an idea way ahead of the printing and figure out what the supply chain can do, and then be able to actually design to that common design and be able to hand that out to the supply chain and get that actually produced. So that probably is complicated sounding, and we're going to kind of walk through it, and that should give you a little bit of an idea of what we're going to do. But when we run through it, I think it will make much more sense than that. The whole idea is getting the marketing and creative in the front end to know what the print end can do and to be able to design to that, and also to communicate and kind of control what the print end does by giving clear direction, clear communication. Before we do that, I'm going to give a really quick intro to the Idealliance BrandQ program. So the Idealliance BrandQ program was developed probably about 2 years ago. And the whole idea was to help brands be able to work with the supply chain better. It has three main components. One is communication, and that's to enable communication between the brand and the supplier. The second is education, educating the brand on how to work, measure, specify, and communicate what they want for printing, and the suppliers as well, so that everybody's speaking the same language and talking about the same thing. The third component of it is to validate. And Idealliance does quite a bit of that, from teaching people how to validate themselves to other large brands that Idealliance actually does some measurement and validation for. A couple pictures here. This is education. This is one of our BrandQ classes, and showing pictures of print buyers and creatives, and they're learning how to measure. You can see they've got sheets in front of them. They're hands-on measuring, working with it, and learning how to understand and communicate what they need. Under communication, this is same class, and looking at some artwork and figuring out is it what we need or not what we need, and how do we talk to the printer about that. And then validation, and these are a bunch of little tools that Idealliance has in part of the class where you learn how to measure and how to check color. and how to kind of follow up on what you ask for. So that's the Idealliance BrandQ program, and that's available online. If you go to the Idealliance website, you can get more information. There's an online version of it, and at certain points there is a live version of it as well delivered, but the online version is very inexpensive, gives you the whole idea, a good way to get started with it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move into and start and talk about this whole idea and concept of design intent. Design intent, the definition of it or talking about it, the main idea that we have behind it is being able to tell what we're going to print to. So instead of going to a printer and seeing what they do or having them make a proof and having them tell us what they're going to do, the idea is to specify a print condition, and I'll talk about that in just a second as well. But specify a print condition, and then to share and communicate that print condition with your suppliers. And based on having that print condition, being able to use that so that you can design and see what things will look like way before you get to the printing stage, so that you're designing something that can be printed and can take full capability of the process, but also something that will be easily printed by the supply chain. So this is the idea we're talking about today, which is getting the front end all organized and understanding what you're doing so that you can communicate it back through the supply chain. If we look at that first thing that I talk about there, that first piece is about specifying a print condition. And for specifying a print condition, the main idea there is we're trying to figure out, with the type of printing that we're doing, with the type of suppliers we're doing, and the substrates that we're working with, what are the capabilities? What can be done with that print condition? What is the best print condition for that? And if we looked at examples, if you're on folding carton, usually it would be a version of Grackle that might be substrate corrected. But if we were doing wide format where the gamut is much larger, it wouldn't be as simple because we'd want to get the most out of it, but still have it relate to other types of printing that we do. But the main idea is we're picking that print condition based on the type of printing that we're doing and based on what our supply chain can do. The second thing is we have to basically pick a print condition that connects to what the supply chain has for capabilities. And so if I had somebody with a brand new press, like this morning before I hopped on this call, I was on a brand new 6-color press. So it's, new inline spectros, taking pictures and recording color all the way through. Very good, very nice. And the capability of that press, maybe compared to a 15 or 20-year-old press that I might use for certain types of printing, would be very, very different. So on that new press I was on today, I could easily expect, and I was getting spot colors, down around 1.5 or 2 delta E easily. On an old press, on a not so good substrate, that would be much more difficult to get that across the sheet and get it to be consistent. So we're looking at capability, and that relates to what you're paying for the work as well. But that print condition that you pick, it has to be connected to what can be done in that supply chain. A good example, I mentioned using Grackle, but if you were on an uncoated or a craft paper or something like that, then that would no longer be a print condition that would match that. And the print conditions, if you're interested, the BrandQ training kind of runs through what all the big common standards are and what they're meant for, and it talks about how to adapt those. That other part of the print condition, which is adapting, that's where we can take and we can use tools that use print standards so that we can adapt to substrate or type of printing or create custom print conditions. So in some cases, maybe printing on plastic or printing with very large format color, at that point we may actually adapt and not just use a print condition that's out there, but create one. The key idea here is we're picking a print condition that relates to what our supply chain can do and the type of substrates and materials that we're on. And then the second part there is we're then going to take that and we're going to be able to provide that information to everybody in the supply chain. So that means from the designer way up front, all the way to the printer in the back, they're all going to have the same target. So as we're making maybe Epsons and proofs and looking in Adobe Creative Suite, we're looking at that same color space. And as the printer is working on it and printing to it and calibrating their presses, they're aiming at that same color space as well. So this first step is the one where we pick our print condition. And you're trying to pick a print condition that's very common, and I'll talk about this in just a minute, and very easy for printers to get to. And I'll run through that in a minute so that will make more sense. That print condition, what we're looking at as we're doing that is something called characterization data. And that's all the color information that people in the supply chain need to know. And you can see on that first little bullet point that I call that the DNA of the print condition. And it really is. It's all the information that's needed to reproduce or clone that print condition. It has all the color info. What are the colors? What are the overprints? What are the gray balance points? What are all the colors in between those? And that lets us do a whole bunch of different things with our workflow. The first one is communication, and that means that we can tell everybody what we're trying to do. So we can communicate to the printers, to the finishers, to the people bidding on the job, people producing the job. But more importantly, we can also go way back upstream to product development or marketing, and they can use this same print condition to develop materials that we know that we can produce on a large scale. So that visualization, that could be as simple as putting profiles into Creative Suite, or it could be popping those into an Epson so that we can get a proof. Or on the print end, it's used to aim a press. And for a digital printer, it's used as a profile to actually aim the digital printer. But this characterization information, so, this print condition, which would be another word for it, it gives us a way to communicate what type of printing we're doing and what the printing is. So this becomes really, really important. This becomes what everybody in the supply chain goes to for that particular product or product line. There's a whole bunch of ways that you pick it, and there's depending on how you pick and what you pick, it's going to have some really big implications on how it impacts whether you're going to succeed or not. And if you look down there, that's just an example, but that's 7 different G7 print conditions. They range from a newsprint all the way up to a wide gamut color space. You could pick existing ones, or you can adapt existing ones. But the big idea is the closer you are to the way that your supply chain is calibrated or printing, the better the chance that you're going to succeed. So if you're asking your printer to do something they don't do every day, or do a print condition that's different, then they may have a lot of trouble with it. If you're asking them to do something they do pretty much all the time, then you're going to have a much better chance at hitting it. Examples would be if you change your lighting, or if you changed your measurement parameters or things like this, or used a standard that isn't common, then you're pulling them out of their normal mode, meaning they have to switch equipment, switch their way they think, switch all their measurement devices, and the chance of people consistently doing that on a large scale and getting it right is not very good. There's some implications here, and I'm going to talk about these for just a couple of minutes, but one way that we can look at it, if we take a look in the world of certification and print certification, when I work with people, I very often talk to them about look at the supply chain out there and see what they have, in the part of the world you're printing in and what you're doing. Make sure you take a look at that. So there's some examples of that. And one example, of course, would be G7, which is one of the things that Idealliance is responsible for and takes care of and develops and moves forward. And G7 is a method and a specification for printing. But if we look at that, if we look at some of the examples of what happens with that, in the world of print, if we were to look at certification, there's about 5,000 G7 master printers all over the world. If I popped up the Idealliance map of where the offices are, there's, I think, 12 offices, which range from South Africa to Asia to Australia to Europe to China. all over the place, and of course the U.S. and Latin America. So there's these offices. In these offices are training classes that are offered throughout the year. And also because of those training classes, there are experts and there are certified printers in those regions. So the big idea there is when you're looking in those areas, you can know that there's somebody who can do that type of printing and somebody that can help a printer do it if they're not already doing it. So 5,000 plus certified G7 master printers in the world. And if you were to look at some of the other certification schemes that are out there, there's, the FOGRA PSO, and there's something like 290 of those. Pantone has somewhere around 20 of their certified printers, but there's nothing of that scale. So when I'm having people who are going to print globally take a look, I have them try to look at the supply chain and see what they're doing, and importantly, what type of support is there out there. So example being, if I was to pick G7 and a spec like Grackle and look at the supply chain, I can pretty much be on every continent and have, there's thousands of printers around the world doing it, and I can know that there's going to be support and there's going to be printers and there's going to be experts who can help that to happen. So that part, and if I back up one slide, it says worldwide certification schemes and their impact. That is built in, meaning that is built into almost every instrument out there. G7 is. There's many people out there with the method. Most of the manufacturers support it. So that has a lot of implications when you go out to hit a supply chain. It's a standard way of doing things, and it has a lot of support for that. The other implication that I was going to show, and I'm just going to pop out of this for 1 second and pop to another program. And let me just find it. Hang on 1 sec. Okay, I'm going to draw just like a little, let me find it, my program here. I'm going to draw a little sketch to show something real quickly. And let me just grab my app. And it's, excuse me 1 second. And I'll do it, maybe I'll do it in here. So I'm going to pop in here. I'm just going to sketch something out real quickly just so that everybody can kind of take a look at it and see what it looks like. And all right, so okay, so I'm gonna draw like a little illustration that I often show people, and it has to do with the supply chain and how the supply chain works and different ways of doing it. So imagine that I'm a brand and I have a little piece of artwork that gets used, and my little piece of artwork is CMYK artwork. In this case, could be spot color or something else. But imagine I have a supply chain, so I'm going to be using this. I might have, 4 gravure printers, and maybe I have like 15 litho printers. So I have a whole bunch of litho printers that I work with. 15 of those. Flexo, I might have 4 Flexo people doing the flexible packaging part of it. And then I might have a few wide format building out stores and doing displays and things like that. So in this supply chain, I have, I have my gravure printers, I have my many litho folding carton printers, some Flexo, some wide format printers. And basically there's the way that this gets done in the old-fashioned workflow would be somebody like a pre-media company might come in, and they would basically fingerprint or characterize each of these suppliers. And then whenever the supplier is going to print for that brand, they would create a file. and they'd send that file to whatever printer is going to get it, and that's how they'd produce it. So if I looked at that 15, so I've got something in here like 30, 32 different pieces of that artwork. This is one product, so I have one product here. I have 32 different pieces of this artwork. And this is only one product. Imagine if I'm a company that has 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 products. Then at that point, imagine the complexity, because if this printer goes offline, this job isn't going to go to them, and I now have to move it up here. I have to reconvert it or find that file and change it and make sure I have the right piece there. If I look at the method that would be with G7, I have my same thing, my little piece of artwork. I can have all my different printers, so my 15 different litho printers. I can have my 4 flexo printers. I can have my wide format printers. And then I can have my gravure printers. And G7 is based on something that has a benefit called shared neutral appearance, and that means that no matter where you print, things look about the same. So what that means is, in this case where I have this little piece of artwork here, I have one piece of artwork. So I have one piece of artwork right here. This other way of doing it, I have 32 different pieces of artwork. This one piece of artwork should be able to go to any G7 printing system and look somewhat the same. So if you look at this, this is simple. I've got one piece of artwork. I can use it anywhere I go. That's G7. Or over here, I have 32 pieces of artwork. And in this case, if I do something, need to move a job, or I get a different printer, or the printer recalibrates himself, I have to go through all this complexity over here again. So this is kind of the, the picture of why brands tend to use G7 and why it's so popular. If you look at why there's 5,000 plus G7 master printers out there, that gives you kind of the quickie illustration of it. Okay. So those are some of the implications of what you pick. If you pick maybe an older way of doing it, you end up with a more complex workflow, or the G7-based methods, and you end up with something quite a bit simpler. Once we pick that, then we end up having to share that specification. That becomes our next step. So at that point, we're putting together detailed documentation that contains color information. It contains all the tolerances, what we look for, and contains everything that both the front end and the back end needs to be able to do this correctly. This morning before I got here, I was doing that last part, which was at the supply chain for helping them qualify for their brand, so their brand could see that they could do what was needed. But this spec, once you share it, becomes really important. That becomes what everybody's going to go through. Once we've done that, then we can begin to visualize it. So when I talk about visualizing the print condition, the idea that we have there is using that data and using that color data, the characterization data, and profiles so that we can make proofs, and we can work in programs like Creative Suite, and we can actually see what we're going to get. So this may not sound like a big deal, but it's a pretty big deal, because there's a lot less turnaround when you can produce this yourself. And when you can see this in a couple of minutes instead of waiting overnight or a couple of days for someone to make their particular proof and send it to you. So visualizing the print condition becomes really, really important. Sonja will talk a little bit about that. But it means that once you picked it, you can make really rapid decisions. You can make designs. You can get a really good idea of what it will look like. And the big part of this, or the important part of this, is you kind of take control. So at the point that you begin to do this, then you're creating control. Instead of being controlled by outside parties, you have a lot more control over what you're designing. You can see what's going to happen, and you can communicate to other people what you expect. So that becomes pretty important. So looking at what we just talked about, we talked about picking a print condition. That print condition should be very common across the supply chain. Should be using a method or spec that's well supported, that many people can support. And then think about all the artwork and things you'll generate. It should be something that won't cause a lot of complexity so that you can move that work around quite a bit. Once you do that and once you develop all that, you can then begin to visualize that, which means you design to what can be printed. And by doing things like soft proofing or having an Epson in your creative facilities, you can see very quickly in just a few minutes what you're going to get and cut your turnaround times a little bit too. So these key ideas, these fundamentals were communicate, coming up with a spec, educate, and that's where everybody in the supply chain and the brand understands it, and then validate, which is making sure that we're all actually really doing it. So that's my little overview of design intent. And I'm a tech, and I'm a person who goes into plants and works with brands on this type of thing. But Sonja comes more from the creative side, and she's very technical as well, but she can give something that might be a lot more interesting because it probably will be a lot more creative, I would expect. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Sonja, and after her, we'll have questions.
Thank you, Ron. Let's see if we can get myself up. Can everyone see that okay?
Not yet.
Not yet?
Nope.
It's coming along.
Yeah. Should be there. It says I'm sharing.
Yes, we see the marble and 93% of consumers.
Okay. So, speaking to the brand side of it, 93% of consumers place visual appearance and color above other factors when shopping, and 85% say color is their primary reason for buying. And if that fact is true, I would say that any of us that are in marketing or in control of our brands, that's pretty important for us. That's a pretty hefty statistic to leave our colors of our brand up to just anybody. So going into what Lindt has put in place probably over the past four to 5 years, it's continually a work in progress. Going along with what Ron was saying to you is that communication is definitely key, and communicating with your vendors on what your design intent is or what your targets are. What we do at Lindt, I'll explain briefly, just kind of an overview to give you an idea of what it looks like for us right now, is that we give documents that we call our global print standards to our print vendors. We communicate to them, as you can see in this image, that what our expectations are for our CMYK color reproduction. Then we also give specs and tolerances for what our spot requirements are as well. In this, we also, you can see up here in the corner with the spectred ends, that not only have we implemented doing delta values, but we also work on hue angles, because for Lindt, some of our colors are very finite, and it makes a big impact on shelf, and that hue angle can swing things in one direction or the other very easily. So that's a very important factor for us, that we are just communicating to our vendors now and working with them on that point. And then the last thing, which was a big thing that we've implemented, we've worked a lot on this year. We've kind of piloted the program this year, working on getting our vendors on board with us as well, giving us reports. So now we have our vendors actually scanning our press sheets while they're on press, even if I'm not on site, into Bodoni Press Sign, and that way I can go into the system, I can look up the reports. That helps me communicate back to them or know that I might have an issue before the packaging is even coming back into the building to me. So overall, that vendor side of it, huge piece of it, to communicate with them what our expectations are. When we set the program up with them, we do require a proof-to-proof match with them to make sure that what they're executing for a proof matches what I am executing internally for a proof. I'll get into that a bit more later. I do have an Epson proofer here in the building with me. And then also we go on press. We do an initial press run before we even qualify them as an okay vendor for us to use. That we go on site, we run a print trial with them. It doesn't even need to be our art necessarily, but if they're running a job, I want to see that their press people have a proof on site, that they understand what they need to do to get what is coming off the printer to match to what's on the proof, and that there's a good visual match as well as a good numerical value match using a spectred end. We highly recommend to them that they have some sort of scanning software press side so that they can be validating the information as the press sheets are coming off. And then once all that is complete and we feel that they do understand what our expectations are and we feel like we're aligned, then we'll go ahead and qualify them to be one of our vendors. Ron was speaking his lovely drawing. Ron, art might be in your future, Ron, I'm not sure, as an illustrator. Going back to your image that you were working on, ICC profiles are a big thing for us. We do communicate to the vendors. We have gravure vendors, we have offset printing, we have flexo vendors. We work with them on the ICC profiles. We work with them on color bar setups, making sure that they have all the information that we need on their press sheets for scanning. Again, this goes back to the proofing side of it, making sure that what their proof is what we expect to see on press, meaning when Lindt goes to a job, when Lindt goes and has a job running on a press, we don't go in there making any changes. If we have a proof, we are pretty much running to that proof. We're not making any changes while they're on press. So initially there was some pushback on working on that proofing system, but most vendors now that we work with, I would say, are pretty happy with that, because I think we're reducing some of the confusion and some of the press time that it takes to run jobs, because we're not going, well, I think that truffle might need to be a little bit more red or a little bit more yellow. What is coming off that proof is exactly what we're expecting to see on print, on the printed sheet, so there are no surprises. Another big communication thing that we have working with them is what ink drawdowns look like. We have pretty tight tolerances, and there's a small snippet of some of our standards or what we're asking for from a print vendor for what our drawdowns are. So we are going in super tight on our drawdowns. I'm looking for about a 1 delta E on the drawdowns with a plus or minus 2 degrees on the hue angle before we even will go to press, so that I know that their ink is in a good spot and it will maintain consistency. We know that it might fluctuate out. Once we get on an actual live running job, we do loosen up that tolerance just a bit for them. There are certain colors that we hold a little bit tighter. There are certain colors that we run a little bit looser. That goes to what that product means for Lindt, but it also goes to knowing that substrates are very different. This particular swatch I have up here, the substrate is not a #1 sheet, so we give them a little leeway on that. So that's for the print side, but knowing that we also take some ownership from the design side. So our internal design team and our external prepress team, we also communicate with them the ICC profiles. You can see here that we do embed ICC profiles into our documents, and we educate both the internal and external teams on our global print standards so that we're all starting from the same page. It's only fair if we're asking the vendors to do this, that we are also understanding and adhering to those guidelines as well internally. For us, we do have specs on what the color bar layouts look like. We do apply our own color bars to our packaging. The only big learning there is on some folding cartons to make sure you're not in your glue flaps when you're putting your color bars on there. We've run into a few of those, but the vendors usually work with you on that and will communicate back to you if the placement of your own color bars is not ideal. Again, Ron spoke to this a bit as well. We do have the luxury of having an Epson proofer in our building, and we do have a RIP on there, so we can, and we also have a proofer on there as well, so we can actually scan we get pretty good proofs off from here, not always 100%. We definitely still have to control it a little bit. Once in a while, we'll have to hand scan it to make sure that the colors that we're expecting come off the proofer as they should. I think this is probably one of the key things for us, is having this proofer has changed a lot for us. because I used to go on every single press check and I would show the brand team a proof and they would say, okay, great, but I don't like that color, so you'll change that on press for me, right? Well, that leaves it up to me or somebody on my team to judge what the right color might be. And so this has eliminated that. Now the brand team knows that what they're getting for, what they're seeing in this building for a proof is pretty much at least 90% what they're going to see when we're going to press. So that takes a lot of stress off the team, and we know much better what our expectations are when we walk out of the building and when we walk back in the building. And then the last thing that we have is we do have spectral dens here in-house. We actually have two, and our QA team also has one, so that we are able to hand scan, you know, on the fly. We do take them, if we do have to go on press checks, we do take these with us. We do have them in-house so that we can scan on the fly. Even if we don't have the opportunity to scan it into, we happen to use PressSign here. There are definitely other great softwares out there to do reporting. And our QA team also recently purchased one, and they have it down on the floor. So if they have an item come into the warehouse, they don't have to run upstairs and come ask me if a color is okay. If they think something is out of spec, they actually have the capability to scan down in the warehouse. So overall for us, as you can see, implementing this type of system, I will say that there are definitely bumps along the way. I won't lie and say that this has been easy, but I will say at the end of the day, being able to, you know, have these reports, and for some reason that slide seems to have been hidden. There should have been I apologize, there should have been one on how we report, showing you a little slice of, you know, that reporting system. We do have the vendors scanning some on a daily basis. I can go in and I can look at any jobs that somebody is running. I can compare it to any print sample that they send to me and say, I see this was a little bit off. I see, you know, they might run 10 scans for me, and I might see that 1 or 2 points during the print run that they were a bit off, and be able to communicate with the printer to be sure that they caught that and that not all of the packaging reflects that hiccup in the system that I'm seeing. So that is another big thing that they're doing, is each vendor that we have does have the ability to scan in constantly for us, and that's been another huge thing for us this year, is being able to check back and forth. So as you can see, I mean, for us, it's a big win. It's a win-win for us. It's a big win. It's a big win also for the print vendors, because the design teams can align with us before before any art leaves the building. The designers and the pre-press agencies understand exactly what we're getting, because we have a proofer, and we know that the printers and all the print vendors are aligned with us. This has definitely reduced our need to be on site for press checks, so it has saved money in travel. I know sometimes purchasing a spectral lens and an Epson printer might seem daunting up front for that, you know, from that cost perspective. But I know that previous to me owning an Epson printer with its own RIP, I was probably paying $150, $250 per proof. And if I didn't like the first proof, I was having to send it back. I was wasting a couple days sending it back to the printer and then getting another proof back in-house. So you're saving time and money from a proofing standpoint. Definitely clear expectations from the vendor regarding what is acceptable for work. That comes from your proofing. That comes from the reporting as well. There's definitely an increase in consistency, efficiency, and savings. Consistency, especially because the vendors know that you are watching. If you are investing in a proofer and a spectral lens, and you have them, you know, scanning your results into software that's reporting directly back to you, you can pretty well bet that your vendors are staying just a little bit more sharp on your job. And then higher consistency of reprints. I used to get QA samples 1 or 2 times, just, you know, the first 1 or 2 runs of a job. And if that packaging piece was running for the next 4 years, you're not positive. I never see that job again. You're not positive of what is happening. So we can at least now say, time after time and year over year, that because I am able to see reports, I am able to know that these vendors are maintaining consistency of our jobs. And it also helps, the reporting piece also helps for us because I can now start to gather information and share it with our procurement team, and that will help them say, kind of like what are our A vendors, what are our B vendors. That will help them, with negotiations as we go out to bid every few years on our jobs. It's also, we are just, for end of 2019, early 2020, we'll be also onboarding our QA team so that they will also have access to these reports. So they will also be able to go in and pull up different jobs and they'll be able to see it. So we're kind of making this a full rounded process so that our vendors are involved, our design teams are involved, our marketing and brand teams are involved, our QA team will be involved, so that we're going to close the circle on this so that we're all, speaking the same language and expecting the same expectations. So I think that's it for me. I'm happy to answer any questions anybody might have.
Great. Thank you, Sonja.
Yes, Sonja and Ron, thanks so much. That was incredible information that you covered, and both you covered. It was a number of questions that came in, and I'll read through this. I'll have to interpret some of them, but I'll thoroughly actually start with the first one. The first one was, how can we get a list of G7 printers in Asia? I'll answer that one. There's a couple of different ways. You can go to Idealliance.org, and there's a directory on our webpage, or you can email us. We build supply chains for people and act as a global concierge for people all over the world, because people are asking for very specific things in regards to finding G7 printers. We happen to have a ton of offices in this particular case in Asia and all over the world. We have 12 offices. So we find finite things for people, like if they're looking for litho printers and how many colors of presses they have and what size presses they have and how many experts they have in staff. So very finite details. And the things that we do, if you want to email us, we can really dial in and fine tune exactly what you're looking for, and specific for what type of printer, what type of process you're looking for, and specifications. We'd be happy to do that. So feel free to email any of us at Idealliance, myself or Jordan Gorski. Feel free to email to me directly, T. Beckley at Idealliance, or hit our directory. We'd be happy to help with that. The next question would be for Sonja, and this would be a great one. I know a little bit about this, but maybe you could speak to this a little bit. Before you started, this has been a journey for you, Sonja, but before you started kind of putting this really into place, what were things like before you had this very concise process between yourself and your service providers?
As I kind of mentioned, so before we had a proofing system and communicated to our vendors, honestly, I would grab a bag, and let's just let's deal with the Lindor bags. I would grab a bag out of a big plastic bucket and send it to the printer and say, okay, we're going to send you a file, and this is what we expect. This is what we expect it to look like on press. So I was giving the vendor a bag that might have been printed 2 years ago. It might have been printed in Italy, and I don't know what they did on press. I don't know what they did in Italy on press. I don't know how those files were set up, and I was handing it to my vendor and expecting them to match to that. If it was a new item, it was what I had mentioned before, is I would hand them and say, okay, here's your new, teal green bag. And the brand manager might say, okay, that's great. I don't really love that color. You can fix that while you're on press, right? Well, yes, I can, but then it's me, and it's my subjective point of view that day, depending upon if my flight was late, how tired am I, how is the press running? And then not only would I have to match it at that printer, I would then have to take that same item and then go match it. Say that's a gravure printer, I would have to go match it again at my litho printer because I was making a folding carton. And at the same time, my display vendor needed to match my displays that are going to be in store to that same piece. So we were shuffling packaging all over the country and from vendor to vendor, trying to match to it. So at least now this has pulled it all together, and I walk out knowing exactly what the expectations are and what things should look like.
That's a great answer. I've actually watched you do it, and it's amazing to watch you in action with these massive service providers you guys work with. This question actually kind of probably dovetails off the back end of that, and this is kind of unique because, in Ron, you can answer this as well. We see this in our auditing programs. Idealliance creates a lot of auditing programs for brands around the world, and we run into hurdles in different parts of the world that people have a hard time meeting. But the question would be, and Sonja or Ron, you can answer this for a second, whoever. What do you find to be the biggest hurdle to get over on some of the things that you're asking for? Your expectation is it so, and that's the question. So I maybe I'll finite that and say, is it measuring substrate? Is it tolerances? Is it getting the color space? Is it hue angle? Because
I think
go ahead.
I can do it, and then Sonja can give her perspective. But I think, what I see is a lot of it is a training issue. So anything that is new usually is painful for people to do. And then once they do it, and this is very typical at the beginning when a brand begins to do this, it's the first brand they've worked with who does something like this. At the beginning, printers tell me it's very, very painful. But at the end of it, they tell me they become much better and they're much more competent. But it's that initial training of getting, their staff and their people to understand these routines and be able to do these new ways of doing things. That's probably the hardest part. So Sonja, you can give your perspective as well.
I agree. I think that when we first started doing this, I had a lot of pushback, somewhat from brand until they realized that, wait, no, actually seeing an actual proof that is supposed to be exactly what I'm getting on press is definitely the way to go. But I will say it probably took 6 or 7 months for them to trust that system. On the vendor side, I think that vendors that are not informed about G7 somewhat take a bit of offense to the system because they're thinking that you're questioning their capabilities when you go in and ask them to implement this process for you. So I definitely got some pushback from vendors who felt like it was more of an attack on their skill, as opposed to being something that said, no, this is actually going to make it better for you because I'm not coming in as a wild card and you have no idea what I want the day that I show up. Sometimes I don't need to even show up anymore. Most of the time I don't even need to show up. And if I don't show up, they know exactly what my target is without me being there. And if I am there, it might only take 1 or 2 pulls to get to where I need to be, and it's not an all-day process, and it's actually more cost-effective for them. So most vendors definitely gave me pushback, but now, without exaggeration, every single printer that has implemented this and does it, they do it well, and they say that was the best thing we ever did, and we wish that more customers would actually move to this process because it definitely is more beneficial for us to know exactly what is going on before somebody walks in the door. So,
well, I was with you, and I won't say where and when and the situation and who, and yep. You were receiving a lot of pushback and of what they thought they could do, and they didn't know G7, and they actually failed, and because that what they thought they were doing was better, and after you gave them a talking to, things came around very quickly. So yeah. I was present to see that pushback happen, and actually see firsthand how actually far off they were in what you were asking them for. So
Yeah.
that it wasn't slight. It was extreme. So really interesting.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting question. This is something we talk about a lot: is hue angle. So the question is this: with having a tolerance around hue angle, have you had challenges with some neutral shades which may have more hue angle change due to the nature of less saturated colors?
I think less neutrals and probably more pastels and things like that. But yeah, no, hue angle's not easy, and most printers can't necessarily work with it or aren't used to it yet. I mean, Flexo is different and gravure is different, but in the litho side, they're not so much used to it. It has to go back to the ink, the ink room or the ink lab to get redone. But I haven't as much of an issue with neutrals, more of an issue with the pastel-y, reflex blues, things like that, purples.
Yeah, and I'll speak to it knowing most of our stuff, most of the colors that we work with are very saturated. And from a color perspective, we're definitely more pinpoint how we want our colors to look. So that's probably why we introduced that hue angle piece. It was actually one of my sister countries that had kind of pushed for that initially. And it does help us because when your brand color is that finite, that hue makes a huge difference, because what I was getting is I was consistently getting things that were in spec from a delta value, but if I stood 3 of the items up on a shelf to look at, they were dramatically different, even visually. So that's why we implemented that piece. So knowing that, more premium packaging, looking at that, that's why we implemented it. It is definitely a little bit controversial right now. But it does have to actually come from the ink vendor. It's not, once you're on press, you don't have much hope of changing that if you haven't already had your ink swatches set before you run your jobs.
Great. I think that's really helpful responses there. This question, I think this might be a time for one more question, but this question, let me see if I can interpret this here. Okay. Actually, you actually mentioned this before I read the question. You mentioned that on certain types of things you may loosen tolerances. So the question is, when you get to press run, you said you may loosen tolerances, be a little more flexible, I think you said. Is there certain printing processes that you find inconsistency, or that you have to be a little more flexible within tolerances on?
I won't say that I find it from printing style. It's more I'm loosening up tolerances based on substrate. So that's probably more where it comes from. If people are familiar with the products, I might be on a plastic, wrapper. We might loosen up the tolerances there, or the substrate of some of the corrugate pieces. We definitely need to loosen up the tolerances there because the paper quality isn't as good or isn't as bright. And so it is what it is. So you have to make those sacrifices where it needs to. There's only so much your vendor can do with a substrate that they're working on sometimes. And to Ron's point, the only other issue I will say that we see is the knowing your vendor's equipment and what they actually have the capability to do. We do have a vendor that has brand new equipment that's probably only 5 years old. It's amazing, and it does pretty much whatever I need it to do. I have another vendor that their equipment is slightly older, and they're constantly compared to the one that has newer equipment. And they have said that's a struggle for us when we're using a much older press. We won't be able to match to your other vendor because it's just not possible for us based on the age of the equipment.
Yep.
Okay.
So that might be a point where we might make some sacrifices there, because we need to.
Yep. No, that's correct. And then there's a few other spots like seems like overprints in flexo and gravure, they're, less control there. And certain spot colors are more difficult too, and those sometimes can use increased tolerances as well.
All right, great. We have time for one last question, so if you don't mind. And this question actually is not actually possible all over the world, but it's actually I think it's a unique question. I think this question is asked a lot to us from a brand perspective. Does Lindt specify to your service providers substrates that they're required to use by perhaps by brand, by region, the supplier, and by ink they're required to use by region supplier?
For us, the paper is specified, yes, by us. So, and even if you're not in the United States or in North America, they do have different specifications for paper. Yes, we do. We use a pretty bright white sheet for our folding cartons, and we do specify the paper that we're using on the bags as well, which are printed gravure. So yes, we do hold them to a pretty high standard sheet for any of our folding cartons. So that's usually the engineering team, and they're measuring that, they're kind of asking for a certain brightness and whiteness to the sheet.
Right.
And that's common with many brands that, on the higher end, more discriminating, pickier type brands, they tend to specify the substrate, whereas the more commodity-based, lower end, I don't want to say cereal box, but the food type boxes specify paper, but not at the same level that the cosmetics and electronics and things like that specify.
Right. No, absolutely. I think this has really been a very informative webinar. I hope that everyone who's joined us finds that to be the same. Ron and Sonja, thank you so much for facilitating this, and thanks for everybody for listening. Everyone will receive a copy of this in their inbox, and so that they can give it a listen. And I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend, and thank you for taking the time to join us in BrandQ today and for future webinars. We really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yep.